Hello and thank you for joining this SciBoss 2021 discussion between SmartStream and Finextra. I'm Hannah Wallace and today I'm going to be joined by Vincent Kilcoyne, Executive Vice President of Product Management at SmartStream, and we're going to be discussing what more can be done to translate operational risk measurement into operational and financial margin improvements, and also the barriers that need to be overcome. Now, this discussion follows on from Finextra's recent research into the effects of increasing pressure on the financial services industry due to growing competitive, innovative and compliance-based forces felt by institutions. And as a result, the imperative to evolve has found itself as a top priority among large established banks. So this unmitigated dedication to innovation and defence against competition has created an unbalanced focus on margin and revenue growth, while the pursuit of improved operational systems has actually fallen down the list of priorities. So following the old model of pursuing operational processes must be abandoned, and instead a new mindset is needed, one that is open to embracing new solutions and technologies, and will also help traditional firms to overhaul their operations and compete in a new digital age. We welcome now Vincent Kilcoyne to guide us through the topic in more detail. So welcome, Vincent. I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It's an absolute pleasure.
It's really good to have you on. So yes, with the background laid down, can you tell us how has the regulatory climate impacted financial institutions' ability to innovate? I think that's a good place to start.
Well, I'm a firm believer in the concept of the law of unintended consequences. So when we look at the regulatory, shall we say, imperative, post 2007, 2008, the banks had to undergo a large technology refresh and revisit. And a huge amount of the innovation budget that was potentially being considered, looked at, explored, etc., or allocated, was now being redeployed to address the regulatory challenges. Such things such as BCBS 239 drove a massive sea change in the technology approaches. So that's one part. And from that perspective, the banks really did, and the larger organizations really did look at their technology ecosystems, their technology strategy, and really try to work out how could they address these compliance challenges in the short, medium, and long term. And in many cases, they embarked on fairly substantial investments to create systems, approaches, etc., that were compliant and gave them a degree of flexibility. But still, fundamentally, they went with predominantly point solutions to address each individual piece of regulation. So this, to a certain extent, in many cases, painted them into a corner because the solutions were point solutions. They were for a specific purpose, and they didn't really have the ability to be deployed to solve problems for other banks. Why would they? They didn't need to be. The problem associated with that is that they're really only going to solve the problem for that specific bank, and that creates a degree of technology debt, right, and technology friction. When we look at the law of unintended consequences, what actually happened was a lot of the innovators and the innovative thinkers became frustrated with the lack of investment in innovation, and that then drove the massive growth in fintech innovation outside of the banking sector, where a lot of the innovative thinkers, innovators, etc., had identified the operational challenges and the disconnects and the misuse of the data that was available across the ecosystems to create new, interesting, exciting fintechs. So the banks then decided to come up with incubators, accelerators, etc., to gain direct access to that skill set. So the banks themselves have actually been created, or this problem has come about through almost like a bifurcated problem. In order for them to comply, the cost associated with it, the effort, really stymied innovation internally. That stymied innovation created an ecosystem outside of the banks where innovation happened. And now it's a case of how do you bring that innovation back in, right? So this is really what's, in my opinion, what has created the lack of innovation within the banks.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Vincent, for bringing us up to date. And I know you want to talk about quantifying operational debt as well. So how do we begin to quantify operational debt? And how is this impacting the bottom line? What about that?
Right, so it's very simple. I've been working in this industry for 30 something odd years. I've implemented solutions pretty much all over the world. And there's almost like a universal battle cry whenever you sit down with the operations people to say, how are we going to configure this? How do we want to make this work? And then the other part is why. Whenever you challenge a particular approach, you want to say why. And the battle cry, which is unanimous, universal, is we've always done it this way. So
Right.
that ethos exists. Let's call out the elephant in the room. And therein lies the problem, because for many organizations, the concept of we've always done it this way is actually creating technology debt. Therein lies a technology debt problem. What then happens is you create solutions and you implement the solutions in accordance with the operational debt. You've now created a technology debt and an operational debt that are so irretrievably linked that they move forward at the same pace or they don't move at all at the same pace. Right? Then what happens is if you start to build new systems and you code them a particular way, if you're designing them for one bank, you will build them specifically for that bank. As a vendor, we build solutions that are deployed across hundreds or thousands of institutions, which means you have to engineer flexibility into it. So you have to engineer out the technical debt. However, when that encounters its first set of operational configuration challenges, you have to overcome the we've always done it this way problem. What banks need to do is they need to break the mindset of we've always done it this way to look at their processes to say which are absolutely of a regulatory compliance nature and which are of a standard normal operational practice one behavior. So you need to work out which ones you can flex, which ones you can change, and which ones you really cannot. All right. But equally, even the ones that are of a regulatory nature, as regulations change, you need to be able to address that. So the problem exists because you create technology ecosystems to reflect the operations. And then at some stage, the operations are almost like a manifestation of how the system has been configured. And you create the two of these together. We have to be able to break them, to analyze them, and then to change them, and then re-implement and have a new engagement model.
Mhm.
Now, this drives the operational losses that we've been talking about. Okay, and so this is how the two of these really need to be looked at from a holistic approach. But you need to look at them each individual one heuristically, analyze it right down to the most granular level possible, and then come back up and create an actual ecosystem where you have engineered out the technical debt and the operational debt, and you're now engineering in operational flexibility and technical flexibility.
All right, interesting. And of course, we've spoken a lot in the past about banks' legacy systems holding them back. So can you tell us where are the hurdles in banks' legacy systems that cause the most significant challenge for overhauling operational processes? What about that?
Honestly, it's the biggest challenge is to break this we've always done it this way model. All right. And as I said, to look at the operational processes and really be quite brutal. In some cases, you may be required or it may be advisable to bring in external parties to really look at the behaviors, the operational process with a much more clinical, critical, unemotional, or dispassionate perspective, to actually step away from the fact that these are the bank's processes and just say, well, actually, these are processes. Why do we do it this way? And have a willingness to change the processes, okay, to actually be dispassionate, to be uninvolved, to actually look at what is the target operating model we want to create in order to then be able to go back and address the problem. So it really does involve having to step away from the real problem and look at it with much more critical, look at it from an external perspective, bring in external advisors, work with people like ourselves who've been doing this for organizations and with organizations for 10, 15, 20 years. So we know many other ways to solve the problems, remain compliant, all right, but deliver a better outcome.
All right, some good advice there. So tell us which activities within financial institutions are pivotal to the transformation of operational processes, and what do you think is hampering their efforts to make effective progress going forward?
So when you look at pretty much every operational practice within a bank, there is a regulatory imperative or there is an industry initiative. So I look at that from many perspectives. If we look at regulatory initiatives, we've got cash and liquidity, BCBS 239. In collateral, we've got uncleared margin rules. In operations or payments, we've got ISO 20022. I've got open banking. I've got faster payments, real-time payments. If I look in corporate actions, right, I've got regulations there. If I look in fees and expenses, if I look in data, I've got MiFID, I've got MiFIR, I've got all the swaps regulations, etc. So there is no industry that doesn't have regulations. So in reality, when I look at every single business unit, I can say there are regulatory drivers and then there are behavioral drivers, and to separate the two of these. And it's really important for us as an industry, us as vendors, us as advisors, us as partners, to actually sit down and say, yes, we recognize that this is a way of solving the regulatory driver, but we also say that this is also an acceptable, a good, a best practice of addressing the behavioral drivers. And you need to actually be able to separate the two of those. As banks, you also need to recognize that solving a problem from a point perspective is not necessarily the best approach. It tends to actually add to the overall cost. And let's get real here. Every single time you add in another regulatory layer, you're adding in another layer of reporting, but you're also adding in another layer of cost. So if I were to really look at the cost of doing business, I have to recognize that the bar is going to move up constantly because of operational costs due to regulation, etc. But I've got to be able to find a way to address the margin, protect the margin, and most importantly, remove the acceptable or unacceptable costs. And I've got operational costs, I've got technology costs, which I need to manage, and there's a relentless focus on those. But nobody, from what I can see, is really focusing on the inefficiencies in the operations that are causing large operational losses that would immediately feed into any kind of an ROI model for an investment in improving behaviors and improving technologies and practices and re-engineering for a better outcome.
All right, so we've spoken a lot about the challenges so far. So let's come on to the opportunities. How can organizations leverage technological opportunities to improve their legacy operational processes? What about that?
Yeah, so fundamentally, we're looking at a data problem. It's very simple, and I know it's a rather simplistic view of the world, but from my perspective, there are two things that are uniquely a source of data or a source of representation of any institution, and they are the data within the institution and the balance sheet. They are the two universal sources of the truth. Okay, every single activity in the bank creates data, and every single activity in the bank has an impact on the balance sheet. These are the two things. Everything else is a route from database to balance sheet. Let's get practical. So really what needs to be done is organizations need to look at the way in which operations turn into data, data turn into operations, and then it turns into financial impact. Now, this is where the problem comes. There is, and this is probably the unawkward truth, which is that there are many representations of the data across an organization. There will be master data warehouses, and most organizations have got data lake initiatives or that type of structure initiative to create a common golden source, a trusted source of data. Then I've got reporting data warehouses. I've got compliance 239 warehouse. I've got all of these initiatives that are taking a version of the data and then creating their own version for reporting purposes. But when you look at it, a bank is broken into many different time slices. I've got people who operate in the real time. I've got people who operate on an inter-day or intraday basis. Then I've got people who operate on a daily, end of day, end of week, end of month, etc. Because I've got people who make decisions at different speeds. So if I'm looking at the C-suite, they operate on a monthly, quarterly, etc. basis. But One of the problems that was identified by BIS when they were carrying out the deep analysis was the disconnect between the data at the top of the organization and literally right down at the functional. And that has to be broken. That's non-negotiable. That disconnect has to be broken. So all participants who have access to information have to make decisions from a single common trusted source, because that drives confidence. So what the organizations have to try and do is to say, how do we make sure that we've got the correct data, that it has been validated against numerous other sources? I've got to match it, I've got to reconcile it, I've got to make sure that I have a true trusted source of data. If it's in payments, if it's customer data, if it's equity or asset data, if it is anything, it must be a single trusted source that all information and decision making is based on and is driven from. And that's really where you have to go. You have to have that trusted source in order to be able to drive confident decision making, and also be able to provide the regulator with a true single view. Because as the technology improves and the speed of execution improves, the regulatory requirements to move from interday to intraday or to smaller time differences will improve. And if you've got a single source of data, all you're doing then is just increasing the reporting frequency, but you're still doing that within a confident environment.
Well, Vincent, it's safe to say I've learnt a lot today, and for those wanting to learn more as well, I urge them to go and download Finextra's white paper, Cost of Business as Usual, an avoidable drain on margin, produced in association with SmartStream. And you can find this in the resource box on the screen and also via the Finextra website. But for now, I want to thank our SciBoss audience for tuning in and Vincent for sharing your insights. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.